It was September 2025, and over the chill gray waters of the Baltic Sea, an old rivalry found new form. 3 Russian MiG-31 Foxhounds, long-range interceptors born from Cold War doctrine, crossed into NATO airspace above Estonia. On paper, this was nothing unusual. Moscow's patrols had performed these boundary-testing flights for decades, logging countless entries and exits that rarely escalated. But this time, something felt different, even if the Russian crews didn't yet know why. The morning sky was clear. Their radar scopes showed empty air. No intercept symbols, no threats. Everything appeared routine. But unseen above the clouds, 2 Italian F-35 Lightning IIs were already watching, their sensors quietly painting the intruders from miles away. Further north, Swedish Gripen S maneuvered into formation, coordinated through encrypted networks that stitched together a digital web of awareness. The Russians were flying blind in what they believed was a familiar game. They didn't know that the rules of air power had changed. For 40 years, the MiG-31 had been Russia's pride in the skies, a twin-seat, twin-engine interceptor capable of screaming past Mach 2 and climbing to altitudes above 82,000 feet. Its massive Zaslon M radar could detect targets more than 400 kilometers away, and its R-37 long-range missiles could reach 300 to 400 kilometers with blistering speed. The Foxhound was built for reach and raw speed, the same philosophy that once gave Soviet pilots an edge against lumbering bombers. In simple terms, it was a supersonic spear, but in 2025, it was a spear fighting ghosts. These flights weren't random provocations. Each incursion served multiple objectives. Russian crews tested NATO's reaction times, mapped radar coverage, and recorded communication protocols. Every crossing gathered data, and every calm response turned the extraordinary into the routine. Fly across the border 50 times with no serious reaction, and the 51st feels harmless. The strategy was to normalize aggression, to make NATO tired of scrambling, to dull the political edge of airspace violations until they blended into background noise. Until now, it had worked. In recent months, similar penetrations ended the same way: a polite intercept, visual contact, and a mirrored escort back to the boundary. Professional courtesy between adversaries who understood the script. The Foxhound crews expected the same pattern again, but NATO had been preparing for years to flip that script completely. At the Combined Air Operations Center in Uedom, Germany, NATO's digital nerve center for Northern Europe operators watched the MiG formation cross the virtual fence. No alarms blared, no rush of scramble orders. Instead, an invisible choreography began. Through secure channels, data flowed between command stations, air bases, and aircraft already aloft. The response was silent, calculated, and entirely unseen. On the screens in Uedem, 3 radar tracks glided westward, transponders dark. The distance from detection to Estonia's coast was barely minutes, but the controllers didn't react out of panic. This was deliberate patience, the hallmark of a new doctrine. NATO was no longer merely policing its airspace. It was waging an information battle where timing and data replaced brute speed. Over Germany, an E-3A AWACS orbited quietly, its massive radar dome sweeping the region and feeding data to Uedem in real time. Farther south, a US RQ-4 Global Hawk loitered above the Baltic at high altitude, its sensors mapping every electronic emission the Russian jets produced. Allied satellites contributed signals intelligence, creating a layered picture of the encounter before the Foxhounds even reached Estonian skies. For the first time, every NATO sensor across land, sea, and space was fused into one living network. From a Murray Air Base in Estonia, 2 Italian F-35 seconds lifted off under radio silence. No radar pings, no transmissions the Russians could detect, just quiet shadows moving through thin air. The pilots relied entirely on passive detection and their aircraft's advanced sensor fusion. The target area lay near Vainlu Island, a small strip of land only 28 kilometers from Russia's border, a frequent flashpoint for airspace provocations. Amari, along with Šiauliai Air Base in Lithuania, formed NATO's forward-deployed quick reaction chain. Geography made the Baltic states vulnerable, but it also positioned them at the front line of alliance integration. As the MiG-31 seconds crossed the invisible border into Estonian airspace, their flight computers registered nothing abnormal. The radar scopes remained empty. The Foxhounds' crews expected contact by now, perhaps the standard pair of interceptors moving into formation, a professional escort, a photo op for tomorrow's intelligence briefings. But there was nothing. Only silence on the radio and the steady hum of engines at 50,000 feet. What the Russians couldn't see were the F-35 seconds already there, hidden below the horizon, their AN, APG-81 AESA radars operating in low probability of intercept mode. Every electronic signal from the MiGs, from radar sweeps to encrypted chatter, was being logged in real time. The F-35 seconds distributed aperture system and electro-optical targeting sensors formed a bubble of awareness that stretched for hundreds of miles. The stealth jets didn't need to broadcast power. They listened, analyzed, and watched. Their mission wasn't to shoot, it was to learn. Every radar system has a fingerprint, frequency, pulse repetition, scan pattern like a digital accent that reveals its identity. Once recorded, those signatures become part of NATO's electronic warfare library, a growing database that defines how to deceive or jam each specific threat. What was happening over Estonia wasn't just an intercept, it was reconnaissance at the speed of information. The data collected in those few minutes would serve every NATO pilot facing MiG-31 seconds for years to come. Meanwhile, far to the north, two Swedish JAS-39 Gripen Es lifted from their patrol station. Their radars remained off, their cockpits dark except for data streaming across Link 16, NATO's secure, jam-resistant data link that allowed multiple aircraft to share the same tactical picture. Everything the Italian F-35 seconds saw appeared instantly on the Swedes' displays. Without emitting a single radar pulse, the Gripen pilots knew where every target was, what frequencies were active, and how the enemy formation was flying. In earlier eras, such awareness required visual contact or radio guidance from a ground controller. Now it flowed invisibly, faster than any human could coordinate. The Gripenese Skyward G infrared search and track and AREXIS electronic warfare suite gave them another edge. The Swedish aircraft could detect heat signatures and manage active jamming without ever switching on conventional radar. Together, the F-35 seconds and Gripens formed a lethal symphony, one silent, one flexible, both unseen. It was the purest example yet of what the military calls network-centric warfare, information as the ultimate weapon. 2 decades earlier, this scenario would have unfolded very differently. NATO fighters would have scrambled in full view, radar beams cutting the sky, their positions revealed before they even approached. The MiG-31 seconds would have seen them coming from 100 kilometers away, adjusted altitude, and disengaged at will. In 2025, that advantage evaporated. The Russians were flying through a battlefield they couldn't perceive. Using the shared data stream, the Gripen pilots quietly shifted their formation. The F-35 seconds fed them precise coordinates, updating every few seconds. Each Gripen loaded targeting data into its Meteor air-to-air missiles, ramjet-powered weapons with ranges beyond 200 kilometers. The Meteor was unlike older rockets that burned out after a short sprint. Its engine kept producing thrust throughout flight, sustaining Mach 5 speed deep into engagement range. The result was a no-escape zone, so large that targets often received no warning until it was too late. Though no missiles were fired that day, the lock-on capability alone sent a clear message. NATO could have ended the encounter at any moment. The operation adhered strictly to Alliance air policing protocols. Under those rules, visual identification is required before any escalation, ensuring restraint even during violation. But while the pilots held their fire, the networked system around them did not rest. Every second in the sky layered more data into NATO's digital arsenal emissions, positions, and signal behaviors that would be analyzed later by electronic warfare specialists. By now, the MiG-31 crews began to sense anomalies. Their radar sweeps occasionally flickered with ghost contacts that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Radio static spiked without clear cause. The navigation display hesitated, showing minor discrepancies between instruments. Small details, easy to dismiss, yet collectively unsettling. They tried recalibrating systems, checking power distribution, cycling radar modes. The more they probed, the stranger it became. Inside those cockpits, the Foxhound crews faced an invisible fog. Their aircraft, among the fastest interceptors ever built, were suddenly blind in the most monitored airspace in Europe. They couldn't detect a single adversary, yet intelligence analysts hundreds of miles away watched their every move in high definition. The old Soviet-era doctrine had no playbook for this kind of fight. It taught pilots to rely on ground-controlled intercepts, to trust powerful radars and altitude as protection. But those very traits now betrayed them. At Uedem, controllers observed the first signs of confusion. The Russian formation hesitated, slight course adjustments breaking their tight pattern. Analysts recognized the moment. The Foxhounds realized something was wrong. Their instruments disagreed. Their comms degraded. What they didn't know was that NATO's electronic warfare architecture had already mapped their emissions and begun limited interference tests, minute disruptions, introduced to study how the MiG systems reacted. Nothing destructive, just enough to sow uncertainty. One operator compared it to dimming the lights in a room full of mirrors. The reflections still existed, but nothing looked quite the same. The Russians were trying to orient themselves with tools that no longer told the truth. In those few minutes, decades of air power philosophy collided. On one side, the Russian belief in physical dominance, speed, altitude, raw radar power. On the other, NATO's digital approach, stealth, data fusion, and electromagnetic control. The Foxhounds, products of the 1,970 seconds, found themselves in a 2025 battle space designed to neutralize everything they represented. As the minutes passed, the pressure inside the MiG cockpits mounted. Pilots checked backup frequencies, switching channels in search of ground controllers. Nothing but static. Threat warning receivers blinked erratically, suggesting radar locks that didn't exist. Electronic clutter filled the airwaves, each instrument contradicting another. The sky outside remained calm and blue, but inside the Foxhounds, confusion turned to unease. One of the Russian backseat weapon officers noted a strange phenomenon. His radar indicated a target at one bearing, while his wingman's screen showed it at another. The discrepancy widened until both displays contradicted the aircraft's actual heading. He tapped the console, checked the power flow, recalibrated, still inconsistent. Something, somewhere, was distorting the picture. They were no longer sure what was real. From the ground, NATO's controllers watched the Foxhounds drift, minor corrections betraying internal uncertainty. The alliance had proven its point without firing a missile. Control the data, and you control the fight. At 50,000 feet, the MiG-31 seconds, once symbols of Soviet speed and strength, were flying through an invisible cage built of algorithms and radio waves. This was the exact moment when awareness dawned inside those Russian cockpits. The pilots, trained to dominate by velocity, realized that speed meant nothing when they couldn't see their opponent. The instruments that once defined their power now betrayed them. They were moving fast and completely blind. Their confidence wavered. The Foxhounds banked slightly east, hesitant. The first sign of retreat, unspoken but visible to every radar operator watching from NATO's side. They hadn't been attacked. They hadn't even been hailed, yet they knew instinctively they were no longer in control. Inside the MiG-31 cockpits, seconds stretched into small eternities. Every instrument that once defined order now whispered chaos. Warning, tones flickered in the helmets of Russian crews, missile alerts from directions their radars swore were empty. Static hissed across the intercom. For pilots trained to trust the machine above all else, nothing was more terrifying than realizing the machine no longer told the truth. From far below, the calm voice of a Swedish controller cut through on the emergency frequency, measured and deliberate. Russian aircraft, you are entering restricted airspace. You are under NATO control. Turn east immediately. The words carried no threat, only certainty. They were the audible tip of a digital iceberg already surrounding the Foxhound. The message was brief, but it confirmed what the Russian crews feared: someone else owned the sky. In the operations center at Uedem, technicians watched the MiGs' telemetry twist and scatter. NATO's electronic warfare architecture, coordinated through the Combined Air Operations Center, had begun its full-spectrum test. The Gripen E fighters, now within tactical range, activated their AREXIS pods, injecting sophisticated digital radio frequency memory jamming into the MiGs' radar bands. False echoes bloomed across the Foxhound scopes, phantom fighters ahead, missiles approaching from behind, a dozen ghosts for every real contact. Their once formidable Zaslan M radar, designed in the 1,970 seconds to track multiple targets over hundreds of kilometers, was now being deceived by signals it couldn't distinguish from its own. Every radar pulse the Russians emitted became a doorway for exploitation. The jammers listened, analyzed, and retransmitted slightly delayed duplicates reflections of nothing until the MiG systems drowned in their own noise. Threat receivers shrieked contradictory warnings. Missile approach indicators flashed without pattern. The Foxhounds were blind and deaf, their digital senses hijacked by invisible hands. Meanwhile, the Italian F-35 seconds stayed completely silent. Their mission was never to engage, only to observe and record. Each radar emission from the MiGs, each reaction to interference, was captured and streamed in real time to Uedem and to intelligence analysts in Ramstein Air Base. For NATO, this was a goldmine of electronic signatures: how Russian avionics handled jamming, what frequencies their backup communications used, which countermeasure protocols kicked in under stress. It was data that could shape every future encounter, not just in the Baltic, but anywhere those aircraft might appear. To the Russian pilots, though, the experience felt like flying inside a hallucination. At Mach 2, even a few seconds of uncertainty can be fatal, and yet there was no visible enemy to blame. Their altimeters and navigation systems were still nominal. The engines roared steadily, but the tactical picture, the essence of modern air combat, had vanished. They could neither fight nor flee effectively because they couldn't define the battlefield. The backseat weapon systems officer in the lead Foxhound toggled frequencies, calling for ground-controlled intercept guidance from Murmansk. Nothing. The link that Soviet doctrine relied upon, centralized ground direction feeding instructions to interceptors, had been cut. NATO's jamming spectrum denied those channels without even targeting them specifically. It simply overwhelmed the frequencies with subtle interference. The very loudness of Russian transmitters, once considered strength, made them easy targets. Down in Uedem, one of the senior controllers, a colonel who had flown F-15Cs in the 1,990 seconds, leaned back and murmured to a younger analyst, "They're still fast, but they're fighting yesterday's war." He wasn't gloating, he was stating a transformation decades in the making. For generations, air dominance had meant speed, altitude, and firepower. Now, dominance meant information: who saw first, who connected best, who managed the electromagnetic spectrum. The Baltic encounter was living proof that warfare had migrated from metal to signal. As the Foxhounds floundered, the Swedish Gripen simulated what would happen next in a real engagement. Using data from the F-35 seconds, they performed lock-on exercises with their Meteor missiles. Targets were designated, firing solutions calculated, but triggers left untouched. The goal was deterrence through awareness, demonstrating capability without drawing blood. Had the missiles been released, the outcome would have been certain. From over 200 kilometers away, the ramjet-powered Meteors could have reached the MiGs long before the Russians even realized they were under attack. Inside the cockpits, frustration gave way to resignation. One pilot switched his radar to standby, hoping to clear false return. Another disabled the data link entirely, reverting to visual navigation. Their discipline held. They did not panic, but the tone of the intercom changed. Short, clipped phrases replaced confidence. Check bearings. Confirm altitude. You see them? No one did. They were surrounded by silence. For NATO, that silence was the victory. No need for missiles or dogfights, just proof that the alliance could control every layer of the air domain without being seen. The engagement had become a classroom demonstration for 21st century deterrence, an enemy neutralized not by destruction, but by confusion. In the broader strategic picture, the implications were profound. The data harvested from that short encounter expanded NATO's electronic order of battle files, refining its ability to spoof, jam, or blind Russian systems anywhere on Earth. Each recorded waveform became a line of code in future countermeasures. Each reaction of the MiGs under duress revealed the logic of their onboard processors, knowledge that cyber warfare specialists could later emulate in training simulators. The operation also validated years of investment in cross-national integration. Italian stealth fighters, Swedish fourth-generation jets, American drones, German command networks, and Baltic radar sites all worked as one. That unity had been tested many times on paper and in exercises, but this was the first time it unfolded in a live incursion. Not a single NATO aircraft fired a shot, yet the outcome was decisive. When the MiGs began turning east, the change was immediate on every display in Uedem. Vectors bent homeward, formations widened, and engine heat signatures drifted toward the Russian border. The Swedish controller transmitted once more, calm, firm, final. You are leaving NATO airspace. Maintain your current heading. No reply came back, but acknowledgement wasn't necessary. The message had already been delivered through the outcome itself. As the Foxhounds crossed the boundary line, NATO fighters shadowed them invisibly. The F-35 seconds maintained sensor coverage until the Russians were safely back over neutral waters, ensuring the retreat was orderly and complete. Only then did the alliance stand down the electronic warfare overlay, restoring the electromagnetic environment to normal. The sky, for the first time in an hour, was truly quiet. Inside the operations room, the atmosphere was professional but electric. Dozens of screens still glowed with captured waveforms and telemetry logs. Analysts were already tagging, categorizing, and encrypting the data for long-term storage. Everything from radar sweeps to voice fragments would be dissected over the coming months. For intelligence officers, this was equivalent to capturing an entire playbook of adversary tactics. In contrast, the Russian crews flying home faced a different debriefing. They had violated NATO airspace as ordered and returned alive, but they couldn't explain what had gone wrong. To their commanders, the radar anomalies and communication failures might sound like excuses. Yet within the flight logs lay patterns that specialists in Moscow would later find disturbing. Emissions disrupted precisely at key frequencies, interference synchronized with every radar pulse. Someone had been inside their systems without ever crossing the line of engagement. In military history, humiliation seldom happens in silence. But this one did. No wreckage, no propaganda victory, just the unmistakable realization that the era of brute force air superiority had ended. The MiG-31 seconds remained fast, powerful, and imposing, but they were analog giants in a digital world. Their strength, speed, and reach meant little when adversaries could bend the electromagnetic spectrum around them. Within hours, Estonia invoked Article 4 consultations, prompting the North Atlantic Council to convene. Diplomats framed the incident as a grave violation, yet behind the political language was quiet confidence. For the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the event reaffirmed that NATO's protection was not symbolic. It was practical, tested, and real. They had seen it on their radar screens. 3 of Russia's fastest interceptors entering their airspace and leaving without firing, without even seeing who opposed them. The United States Air Force sent its own observers to review the exercise. What they found reinforced years of doctrine about multi-domain operations, how land, sea, air, cyber, and space intertwine. The Baltic demonstration became a case study at NATO schools and American war colleges, illustrating how to win control of the battle space before the first missile launch. The lesson echoed far beyond Europe. Information dominance is the new form of deterrence. In the following weeks, engineers at Allied bases processed terabytes of raw data. Signals from the MiG radars were broken down into waveforms, plotted, and compared with earlier encounters. Patterns emerged, showing how the Russian systems shifted frequencies under pressure, knowledge that would feed directly into future electronic attack programs. What began as a border provocation ended as a treasure trove of technical intelligence. Moscow's reaction was predictably defensive. Official statements denied any airspace violation, blaming malfunctioning transponders. Privately, however, Russian defense analysts understood what had happened. Their high-speed interceptors had been outclassed not by superior pilots or faster jets, but by an invisible lattice of sensors and algorithms. The revelation forced uncomfortable questions inside their aerospace command. How much of their fleet could survive in a truly contested electromagnetic environment? For NATO, the victory was quiet but transformative. It validated the investment in stealth platforms like the F-35 not merely as fighters, but as sensor nodes, eyes, and ears that could make every Allied jet deadlier without exposing themselves. It proved that fourth-generation aircraft, like the Gripen E, still had enormous value when connected through data links and backed by advanced electronic warfare. And most importantly, it demonstrated that deterrence in the 21st century depends less on weapons fired and more on networks maintained. To the outside world, the incident faded quickly. A brief headline in defense journals, a short statement from Brussels, a muted denial from Moscow. No dogfights, no wreckage, no casualties. Yet within the military community, it marked a turning point, as clear as any battle. It showed that dominance of the electromagnetic spectrum could neutralize traditional air power without crossing the threshold of war. Analysts compared it to the shift from cavalry to tanks a century earlier. Those who adapted to the new domain thrived. Those who clung to speed and armor alone became relics. The MiG-31 pilots had felt that shift firsthand, not through defeat in combat, but through the quiet horror of irrelevance. In Washington, Pentagon briefings highlighted the event as confirmation of ongoing strategy. Network-centric integration, stealth reconnaissance, AI-driven analysis, these weren't futuristic concepts, they were operational realities. Each alliance encounter now doubled as both defense and data collection, strengthening the digital shield around Europe. One senior Air Force officer described it succinctly. Every time they probe us, we learn. Every time we learn, they lose something they didn't know we could see. The MiG-31 crews, once symbols of Soviet reach, had unwittingly donated the blueprint of their systems to NATO's databases. No propaganda could erase that fact. For the men who had flown those interceptors, the memory would linger. The confusion, the static, the phantom targets, they weren't just glitches. They were the sound of an old doctrine dying. When they landed back at base, ground crews found nothing physically wrong with the aircraft. Engines fine, avionics nominal, radar power within limits. The failure had been conceptual, not mechanical. And that realization, whispered across Russia's air defense community, may have been the most devastating result of all. You can repair an engine, you can't patch an obsolete idea. In the days after, NATO intelligence officers finalized their after-action reports. One line, buried deep within the classified summary, captured the essence of the entire engagement. Control of the spectrum equals control of the sky. The Baltic episode would enter training manuals not as a battle, but as a demonstration of mastery. 3 aircraft entered, 3 aircraft left. No casualties, no wreckage, just a digital watermark left on the future of warfare. To the pilots on both sides, the encounter lasted less than an hour. To strategists, it marked the moment the Cold War's final ghosts met the digital age and lost.